Okay, great. Well, good morning, almost afternoon, everyone. It is great to see you. As we are continuing the conversation in the sage conversations that we've been having, one sort of just reflection, we've sort of heard from everyone a different sort of sets of interests around what are the, sort of what's the happy sort of Goldilocks medium through which we want to have in terms of lecture and time to talk in groups, and what's the sort of happy medium. And there are some who want more time to talk in small groups. There's people who want to hear the awesome opportunities to learn from Donna Tarney. So we're constantly sort of fine tuning that. Today we're going to have an opportunity to really learn from Donna, and then also of course have some conversation as a group, and do some more learning together with a large substantial conversation around what we have read and some of the pre-reading that was sent to you last week. So I'm going to invite Donna to unmute herself, and we'll continue in that conversation.
Okay, good morning. I hope that everybody is doing well and really loving this weather. So spring is finally here, I think, for real, and my garden is safe. And I hope your gardens are safe and you're doing well. Now, I have put in the chat box, and I can put it in again for the people who just popped in, 2 links. They're the links to the readings that Tracy sent out before the session. So one of them was about the emergence of Holocaust denial, literally right after the war ended. People started denying what had happened before most of the world even started reacting. And then the other one was the long compilation of the Christian religious traditions, statements about and reactions to the horrors that occurred during the Holocaust. So what I would like to do today is we're going to kind of break this into 2 sections. First, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how individual countries and the world as a whole reacted politically and socially to the knowledge, the events that people were learning happened during the Holocaust to the Jewish people. And then you're going to talk for a little bit, and then we're going to come back and look at then the religious response to the atrocities that were committed during the Holocaust, because there are 2 separate reactions and they ran on slightly different timelines. So I hope that you learned something interesting today. Now we will have, Q&A throughout, but I was wondering if anyone who, there was a lot of reading, there were a lot of things, if you had a pressing question that, once we get into it, you might forget. So this is a time to ask any immediate pressing questions about the readings that you had. Couple of weeks to look at, a day or so to look at.
Donna?
Yes.
Does the Catholic Church refer to itself as her?
Yes.
In the feminine?
Yes.
As opposed to other religions?
Many Christian religious traditions refer to the institution of themselves as she. And there are lots of reasons for this that are taken from the Christian Gospels, where Jesus spoke about the bride of Christ and the mother of the saved and all this stuff. So it's a very feminine idea, although a lot of priests would balk at that. But yes, they call her she.
Donna, it's Michael.
Yes.
Good morning.
Good morning.
A question that you may want to cover.
Okay.
Which is in the section called Thinking About God After the Holocaust. I think
yes.
That's the conversation with Rabbi Rubenstein, with somebody asking the questions. And the issue that I want to raise with you, and maybe you'll be talking about this, is the way I read this issue was, whereas the covenant starting way back 2,000 years ago had to do with God's displeasure about idol worship and other things that the Jews were doing, right?
Okay. Yep.
And in the current talk, the question came up of whether or not there's still a covenant that we have. And in that particular area, it talked about Judaism as a, what was it, a psychological, let me give you the direct quote, because that really blew me. I didn't understand what that meant. So maybe others will raise that as well. I think
it later.
I'll find it later, but it talked
Okay.
about Jews as a psychological entity. It was, the definition was psychological, and there was no evidence of religion in that.
Okay, I believe that may have been Rabbi Knight's, some of Rabbi Knight's readings. Rabbi Knight, correct me if I'm wrong.
Sorry, can you say can you say the question again, Michael?
Yes. Nevertheless, religion and religious ritual remain indispensable. This is especially true of life cycle events such as the death of a family member with its rituals of leave taking, blah, blah, blah.
Yes.
And in that sense, the covenant exists today as part of who we are. I'm quoting, a social psychological perception of what it means to be a Jew.
Okay.
I would hope that you would discuss that, because A, I didn't understand it, and B, if I did understand it, it was troubling to me. And I'll end that.
Okay. Why don't we try to, I'm going to ask to hold that question, because I think we can, that's actually a great conversation as part of like the religious response, which we're going to get to just a little later.
Right.
Is that okay? But Michael, don't let me off the hook on that one, and let me, and don't like, I want to make sure I get to that question. Okay.
All right, thank you. I'm sorry.
No problem. And I'm loving the archaeological dig shirt. I have one of those as well.
Okay.
Yes, so thank you. And this was a reason that I asked for questions ahead of time, because sometimes once we get into other topics, people forget what they really wanted to ask because now they have a million other questions. So thank you, and we will bank that and make sure that we get back to that one. Okay, so we are at the point where we are looking at what happens after the Holocaust, after the end of World War II, which is the thing that brings an end to the Holocaust. If the Nazis and their collaborators had had more time, there would have been more fatalities, there would have been more murder. We know that as the Russians were coming in from the east and the other Allied forces were coming in from the west, the Nazis and their collaborators were emptying concentration camps and focusing them centrally so that they could rid the world of as many people that they felt were dispensable as humanly possible. We also know that during this time, especially from between 1942 and 1945, particularly American and British newspapers were full of information about what was happening to the Jews. There was very little photographic evidence, but eyewitness after eyewitness was coming forward and telling people what was happening. Jan Karski, who was a Polish underground operative who had an eidetic memory, was smuggled into a camp, and then he came to the United States and talked to President Roosevelt and said, "This is what I saw. This is what is happening. Everything you have heard is true." And President Roosevelt said, "Thank you very much." The Pope and the Catholic faith did nothing to denounce Hitler. Okay, we'll get to that. I promise you, Susan, and thank you for putting it in the chat box. So we have the United States is aware, Britain is aware, the Russians are certainly aware. A lot of what is going on is happening in territories that they used to control, that they were getting pushed out of. The Vatican is aware. The French are aware, the Italians are aware, the Canadians are aware. So people know, but no one's doing anything. So you would think right after the war, people would be like, oh my goodness, now what can we do to help the Jewish population, to help this population that we've heard so much about being horrendously persecuted and killed? But yet, after the liberation of the camps, after the photographic evidence starts pouring out, like there's a flood of photographs as camps are liberated and survivors are photographed, and everything happens all at once. The other thing that happens is the Allied forces that are liberating these camps, and at this time France is considered partially an ally, they turn their emotions about this. You can read a lot of testimony from people who liberated camps. Their emotions were pity and a lack of ability to understand what they're seeing for the victims. And then absolutely immediately anger toward the Germans. So the Germans become this focus point with laser focus. Everyone who discovers these atrocities focuses on the Germans are horrible people, just absolutely horrific human beings. There is something about the Germans. And there's a lot of reasons for this. Number one, politically, none of the countries that knew what happened did anything to stop what was happening in the camps. They had opportunity, they declined for lots of different reasons. So if the Germans are horrible, horrible, horrific human beings, somehow genetically different from the rest of us, then we aren't culpable. So these governments that are, the good guys, they can't be like the Germans. So the Germans must deserve some special treatment for what they've done. So culpability is lifted from the political body if somehow this government, these people are not like us. So ironically, what the political spectrum starts doing is they start using language and they start using imagery that the Nazis had used against the Jews. Because deep down inside, we're all really the same. We all don't want to be responsible for horrible things. And if you didn't help, you hurt. So the United States in particular, they rushed to give aid, they health care. They tried to put the surviving Holocaust victims in, or survivors, the Holocaust survivors in displaced persons camps. They gave money. They finally allowed all of the organizations who had wanted to help. So they sent the Red Cross, so did Britain, so did Russia to a certain extent in certain places. But the other thing that they did, which I just learned about probably 6 or 8 years ago, I was in a hotel, went down to breakfast. My husband was talking to a couple. My husband likes to talk to lots of people. And I noticed that the woman had what I thought was a German accent. And so after we were talking for a little while, and I said, I'm curious where you're from. She said, New York. I said, okay, before New York, because my family I have relatives in Germany. And she said, oh yeah, she came from Germany, but she originally came from a small place called the Sudetenland. And I'm going to share my screen and show you a map in case you're not aware. This is one of the places that Hitler took over. So it's the dark brown, is called the Sudetenland. And when Hitler, before he did anything militarily, he annexed the Sudetenland because large population of Germans lived there. This was part of the land that was taken away from Germany after World War I. So Hitler's like, I'm taking it back. It's mine anyway. So there you go. So this woman that I was speaking to lived in the Sudetenland. And after the war, here's another little map. Germany was sliced up, the areas that Germany had occupied. And so the Soviets controlled this area, they occupied that area, the British occupied this area, France occupied here, and the US occupied this area, and the Sudetenland would have been right in here. So I said, okay, and she said, did you know what happened after World War II? And I said, no. She said, you need to read this book. And the book is called Orderly and Humane. And I'll put this in the chat box. It's by R.M. Douglas. And it is the story of, and it's written in a journalistic style. So it's very emotionless. It's just, here's the facts. Here's what happened. After the war, the 4 Allied countries that you saw on that map thought that they had a solution to what had happened during the Holocaust. It had nothing to do with the Jews. This was not to help any kind of social or economic thing. So again, they were focused on Germany with a laser intensity. If this atrocity happened because these Germans couldn't get along with these Jewish people and the Roma and the Sinti and the other populations, then what probably will fix everything is if now that these victorious allied forces are in there, they're going to create monocultures. They're going to take all the Germans and make them live here. They're going to take all the Polish people and make them live there. They're going to take all the Ukrainian people and the Lithuanians and just like tuck them in little country neighborhoods. And that way, everybody will be surrounded by people who are like them and nobody will fight. So they relocated between 12 and 14 million German citizens who were living outside of the German borders in Eastern and Southeastern Europe. Most of these people were from the Sudetenland and Austria and places like that. They put them on the same trains that the Germans used to deport the Jews. They housed them in the same concentration camps that were now empty. And they literally relocated. Mostly at this point, it was women and children and the elderly, because lots of people had died in the war. But these four countries, in their hubris, in their pride, in their political, they know they're right, relocate an entire country's worth of people because they think it will fix what happened to the Jews, which we know it doesn't. We know people are individuals no matter what language they share, what culture they share. But if you're interested in reading about that experience, it's just the logic that politicians used after the Holocaust to make themselves feel better about what they learned was the first reaction. And this particular instance, this particular situation just exemplifies that beyond belief. That the lengths to which these countries went to make sure that they were not seen as having any responsibility for what happened to the Jewish people. So that was the first reaction globally. Nobody wanted to look at this. Japan was a super interesting study because during the war, Shanghai was actually a haven for Jews. They were allowed to emigrate there. Japan was issuing visas for them to come. They were treated as non-citizens. So any non-citizen of Japan that was in Japan was like cordoned off from the rest of society, treated in a suspicious way. But Jews were not persecuted by the state. They were not harassed. They were allowed to hold jobs. They were allowed to have money, and they didn't have to wear Jewish stars. They were treated as non-state citizens. After the war, you know, we fought Japan. Japan was our enemy. They bombed Pearl Harbor. After the war, when all of this came out about what had happened to the Jews in Europe, Japan said, oh, by the way, we weren't bad to our Jews. So Japan politically actually took this moment in history not to apologize for the atrocities they committed in China. The Nanjing massacre, actually it's called the Rape of Nanjing. They took it as a moment to say, oh, but we were better than the rest of them. So we're not as bad as they are. So this game of who's good now, Japan even gets in on that, even though they were our enemy and we bombed their cities, because they knew that the West wanted to be economic partners with them. And eventually the West did. The West forgave Japan so much. And Japan knew, I'm going to capitalize on that. And we're going to say, we treated our Jews good. We deserve a pass. So these political machinations were just from the moment the last piece of paper was signed. It was all about Germany is an aberration and we are not involved. The other country that was really interesting was France. the northern part of France was occupied by the Nazis and they instituted a puppet government, then the southern part of France, there was a lot more resistance, but they still cooperated with the Nazis until they didn't. And so France's narrative for a long time was, well, we couldn't do anything. Well, you know, we tried. Whereas when the studies came out and more digging was done, France had concentration camps, France had mass deportations, and it wasn't just the puppet government that was involved. France also got a pass. Only 2 of their main coordinators of deportations were ever brought to trial, because the rest of the European countries needed France because it was strategically placed right next to Germany, where we were going to have France occupy the area that had the military capabilities of rebuilding an army in Germany, the Rhineland. So in the face of all of this, the very first reaction was, we just need to fix this politically. We just need to make sure our allies are our allies. And no one talked about the atrocities, even the Nuremberg trials, which lasted from November 1945 to October 1946. They were about who is responsible, who is culpable, who should pay for not only the Holocaust stuff, that was like a secondary, but who should pay for all of the other war crimes, all of the destruction, all of the rebuilding of the cities. So that was the focus of the Nuremberg trials. Some of the atrocities came out, but nothing really nothing made any forward movement in the idea that something had terribly broken down in the moral fiber of the world until the Eichmann trial. And that was not held until 1961. And if you don't know the story, he was kidnapped from, not Buenos Aires, Argentina, by the Mossad, and then taken back to Israel, and the entire trial was shown on television live. There were 112 witnesses, and this was the first time the world had heard and seen testimony of Holocaust survivors. And it was the most impactful thing for moving the narrative of the Holocaust forward for the Jewish people and the Roma and the Sinti and people who came under persecution by the Nazis, because this was not about who was culpable. We knew who was culpable, Eichmann. He was the only one there. This was about allowing the stories to come into the narrative, international narrative. In 1961, almost every industrialized country had access to television. Some places actually showed these movie theaters, showed it every day, day after day after day. It went from April to December in 1961. And this is the moment when people started saying, we've seen the pictures and that was terrible. And then we put our Life magazine away and we went about our lives. But here are 112 individual people. And that started other people coming forward. And it seemed like it was time now for the telling of the stories and the healing of the individuals. And it also elevated the idea that this was not just the German people, because they heard about Ukrainians and Lithuanians and Hungarians. And finally, the story of Austria as the victim started to be questioned. And it wasn't until about 10 or 15 years ago that people actually started saying, yeah, Austria wasn't a victim. Austria welcomed the Nazis overwhelmingly. So it's so fascinating to watch the politics of this, because it starts out with self-centered, inward looking, what's going to be best for us. And then in 1961, it was regular, ordinary people who started pushing the truth in a way that people could listen to. And governments started reacting. The United States in the 1970s actually issued a formal apology. Oh, sorry, we might have known more than we said. And it took 20 more years for them to say, oh yeah, we really actually knew a lot. It took Canada until 2018 to issue an apology for refusing amnesty to 900 Jewish people who requested asylum because of persecution. It took France until 1995 to admit that, yeah, they may have done some things that were bad and we apologize. Japan, of course, has never apologized. Austria has officially apologized. They did that, I think, 3 or 4 years ago, right before this newest crazy conservative political party was elected again. Other European countries have said things, but not ever issued formal apologies. And of course, Russia, which becomes the USSR, they just drop off the map because of the Cold War. And so the USSR has never really apologized for anything. They have, though, begun to release records from the areas that they occupied after the war, and then that fell behind the Iron Curtain. So that's kind of just a summary, and I haven't been reading the chat box. So if I'm going to glance at it quickly. When we send you away, when I send you away, even the term Holocaust, yeah, wasn't used for many years. Absolutely. Leslie, you read the complete testimony of the Nuremberg trials? Oh my goodness. Wow, I've seen sets of the Nuremberg trials testimony. I have never read them. So are you talking about the Eichmann testimony? Leslie, you can unmute yourself and respond.
Yes, no, more than the Eichmann testimony, earlier. Eichmann wasn't in the Nuremberg trials, Eichmann was later.
Right.
Or Eichmann was in the 60s. The Nuremberg
Yes.
trials were in 1945 and 46.
Yes.
Oh, I read that testimony from 45 and 46. Volumes and volumes and volumes, and it was focused on the Holocaust.
Yeah.
It was mostly the crimes from the Holocaust. But there were also, there were discussions and testimony about some of the bombings of Allied cities, the bombings of Canterbury and some of the other cities in England, and some of the bombings, you know, in other parts of Europe, some of the blanket bombings. And the Germans did raise some issues about some of the Allied retribution bombings, but it didn't go over very well. But so most of the testimony was Allied testimony, you know, testimony gathered by the Allies, and very little disputed.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, I'm not wow. That's I'm just so overwhelmingly impressed that you read all that testimony.
I did actually at a fairly young age, but
Wow.
yeah.
That's amazing. Oh, wow. Okay, so the other questions in here have to do with the Pope and the Catholic Church. So we'll get to them after you come back from your breakout session. And what I would really like you to do in your breakout session is, if you haven't read it, click on the link in the chat when you're in your group and read that Holocaust Denial Starts Early. And think about all of the things that are happening politically. How does that make sense? Because that article, when I first read it, I was like, what? But then when you look at the context of what was going on in the world, it makes more sense in context. So talk about the context of Holocaust denial and how it still exists today, like where you see it in the world today. And then if you want to start talking about, you know, questions that your group has about the religious responses, that's good too. But I want you to focus on, how does that early Holocaust denial make sense given the political contextualization, and how is it still here today? Like, why does it still make sense to some people? So that's your goal in your next 15 minutes.
All right.
Couple days
Sounds
ahead
good.
of time.
It's great.
I'll set something up for you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tracy. Hi, John. Have you already been in London, or are you back?
I am back. I was in London for almost 2 weeks in
Good.
April, the first
Good.
2 weeks.
Where'd
That
the
was,
room
the
to-
traveling was so great because nobody was traveling.
London opening up now? England opening up now?
The day before I left, they were just starting to open outdoor dining and
Mhm.
hair salons. Non-essential stores, I think, were still closed, most of them.
Did you have to quarantine to go to England?
Yes. Oh, I didn't do it totally. I went out for walks, but yes, I was supposed to quarantine. I was at my daughter's house. But
Okay.
I was supposed to take several COVID tests, which never arrived when they were supposed to,
Why, surprise.
even though to get on the plane and enter England, I had to show proof that I paid for these tests.
Oh,
Were supposed to be self-administered. $250 worth of tests
wow.
that
Wow.
didn't arrive on time.
So you
Okay.
got in anyway, right? I mean, didn't matter. Okay, I
Yep.
was just curious.
All right, we're
All right.
gonna continue. I think everyone is back. Donna.
Yes. Okay, so I am gonna have to hop off right at 12. Or maybe 12:05. We'll see how this goes. So what did you think about the denial, both historic and present day? I mean, it started right after the war. So some feedback from your groups.
Donna, in group 2, both Joan Kirshner and Judy Jacobson had some interesting things to say. Joan, why don't you tell them, since you reviewed all of that particular literature?
Okay.
Unmute.
Okay. I mean, it was pretty long, the article. So what I remembered was that a person that had been a prisoner at Buchenwald said, oh, Buchenwald didn't have any gas chambers, so there weren't any gas chambers where people were
Right.
murdered. And then other people said, oh, there weren't 6 million killed. It was just Israel that wanted money for these people. And then somebody else, now I'm trying to think, I forgot what else I had to say, but yeah, people had the other was, oh, well, they did kill some people, but the ones they killed were criminals and bad people. They didn't just kill innocent people.
Okay. So in
In
the
other words,
context, yeah.
Sorry, Joan. So in other words, they're ascribing blame to the victims.
In the
In
group,
that case, with that they said they were criminals and bad people. Yes, I suppose.
in our situation, in our room, one of the discussions centered around not only the denial in terms of the Holocaust, but was also centering on how this thing has happened year after year after year on different type of situations that go on, and all to maintain power, all to maintain an advantage, or in order to be politically stronger. That you have to let go of certain things and not say to the Chinese, you can't do this, or say to the North Koreans, you can't do that. So that becomes an issue that has repeated itself. It's happened in the 1940s. It happened during many occasions during our lifetime.
Absolutely. Susan, I see you raised your hand.
Yeah, I forgot what I was gonna say. Oh, Africa has seen many genocides, and largely due to the way Britain and the other imperial countries broke up ethnic peoples so that they didn't have any regard for the ethnicity of a group that came from one country or another. And that set the stage for genocides, for, they hated each other. They were separated from their own. And, England is responsible for a lot of SARS in the world, I'll tell you.
I would agree.
Yeah.
The British Empire was not a good
Right.
thing. Imperialism is
No.
not a pretty sight. Yep. Okay, so some other groups, what did you talk about regarding the Holocaust denial?
Maybe Leslie Cohen can speak for our group.
Okay,
Leslie, would you mind speaking for our group?
Well, we talked about several different things. One was the actual material interest in denying the Holocaust by people afterwards. That there were groups that would gain from diminishing any culpability for the persecution of Jews, or denying that they were ever persecuted, or an extermination process was taking place. And in regards to that, I mentioned I thought there was culpability even by the Allies before the Holocaust actually occurred, and during the Evian conference in 1938, how countries all over the world refused to allow Jews and other refugees, but primarily Jewish refugees, from entering their countries and staying there. And of course, I didn't mention the St. Louis, but that's a very famous example of that too. And these gave permission to the Nazis to continue with their persecution and elevate it to the level of extermination. And so the guilt is not just on one side. And after the war, I mentioned also the whole thing of denazification, and the fact that in the West that there was people were anxious to have the intelligence and expertise of Germans involved in intelligence operations in the military to deal with the Cold War and fight the Soviets. So they in the process, basically, I don't want to say that they, they often hid their Nazi backgrounds and their roles in extermination and in the Holocaust.
thank you. Absolutely. And that is another politically and economically driven thing that happened after the war, is that we welcomed Nazi criminals into our country as long as they had a skill that could benefit us economically or politically. So absolutely.
Or scientifically.
Especially scientists.
Oh yeah, scientifically, but that also helps our economy and our politics, because it positions us in a position of power over other countries that don't have the expertise. So absolutely, thank you so much.
We are dissecting this all today, but I know my neck is very long. We sit here having this discussion, but as we sit here and we're having this discussion, it's happening today.
Yes.
There is a genocide going on over here and over here and over here. And right now, as I see myself and some of the others, we're just bystanders. We're not, that word upstanding. We're not doing anything. We just say, oh, it's a terrible thing, and we go on with our lives. So how are we any different today? Me, myself, I guess I'm just questioning myself. I can't speak for anybody else.
No, thank you, Judy, because that is something that often comes up especially when I go into schools and teach about the Holocaust and other genocides. One of the big things that just happened on April 24th was Joe Biden finally said the word genocide. Absolutely. In conjunction with the Armenians.
That is exactly right.
I know, and I'm getting to know better a young woman who was born in Armenia, and her family chose the United States as their country, for the rest of their lives. And she said she was in tears. She was just tears of joy, because finally someone recognized that what was a genocide politically in the United States, now it's okay for us to politically say the word genocide in relationship to the Armenian massacres. And yes, so what I tell my students is what I'm going to tell you, and it might sound like something small, but it's not. The way genocide begins is when we treat each other as if we don't matter. So what you can do now is look at your behavior toward others in your sphere of influence. Correct your behavior, correct their behavior. bring them up when they're doing something that is creating barriers rather than bringing people together, something that reinforces stereotypes. The other thing you can do, because you're all voting adults, is you can write to your congressional your legislators, whether it's state, county, national, and tell them, I want you to look at what's happening in Syria. I want you to look at what's happening in Myanmar. I want you to get some legislation passed that recognizes these atrocities. I want something done. And if you do that, then you've done what you literally can do in this country.
And we need to do that.
Yes.
Discussing the past is not enough.
Right. The past should always be the lens through which we examine the present to improve the future.
Thank you.
We can't have mistakes that just sit there and go, oh, well, that was then. Okay, we have two people who raised their hands. David, you had yours up first, so I'm going to call on you.
Based on something I read a few days ago on the editorial page of the Charlotte Observer, it's my impression that President Biden is not the first, but perhaps one of the more recent presidents to call the Armenian massacre a genocide. Apparently, the last American president who did so was Ronald Reagan. I don't remember that per se, but that's the impression I got from the editorial page, that presidents up to and including Ronald Reagan had used that terminology. But I'm glad that it's happening once again, because there's no doubt from Armenians I've known that it truly was a genocide.
Interesting. Very interesting. I have to look up to that. No, it says, oh, the closest that a US president had come to recognizing the atrocities as a genocide was in 1981 when Ronald Reagan uttered the words Armenian genocide during a Holocaust commemoration. So he didn't ever officially recognize it on a governmental level, but he said the words. So well, that's, yeah.
That raises an interesting issue about the extent to which we as citizens should expect the government to search for genocides worldwide and act on our behalf,
right,
or the extent to which we as individuals should not let any transgression go. As Jews, we know justice shall you pursue. Let everything be followed up on. And I'm of the belief, and other rabbis have expressed this, that justice is repeated there because it's really hard to do this hard, difficult thing, but it's our job.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And Susan had her hand up, and then Jeffrey will come after Susan.
Just briefly, the rabbi of my synagogue in Boston, in Sudbury, was discussing the Holocaust with the bar mitzvah class my daughter was in, and he said that the time to do something about Hitler was not in 1940 or 1939. Yeah. It was in 1933 when he first came to power. That you have to start there. People ignored it. It just mushroomed and grew. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, Hitler actually is on record saying he didn't want the Germans to hate the Jews or commit acts of violence against them. If they did, great. What he really wanted was for the Germans to not care what happened to the Jews. And if every German didn't care, he could do whatever he wanted.
Right.
So, yeah. So, and Jeffrey?
Thank you. And now we have not just political issues, but you have two major forces in this country that do not give a darn about what's going on in China and the genocide of the Muslims there. That's the National Basketball Association and Major League Baseball. So it has gone from the political realm into our daily lives of sport. And that's a very, very dangerous trend. That is why I've stopped watching those. That's the only power I have as one person.
And I'm a traveler, and I've gotten to be where, like, there's certain places I would love to go and see if it was possible, but I'm not going because I don't approve of the policies. That's a little thing. I'm one person, but the travel magazines are full of visiting these places.
Absolutely. So I would encourage you all, when you stop doing things like this, you stop the basketball, you stop the, make sure they know why, make sure they know that you are, write a letter, write an email and just say, I've stopped doing this because you did this. You know, and I know 6 of my friends who won't send you an email who have also stopped doing this, because that is a form of protest. But if nobody knows you're protesting, then it doesn't make an impact. So this is like, there's a whole nother class now we could do on how to address social ills from an individual standpoint, especially with the issues of genocide that are happening. I need to leave this call. I have like 5 more minutes before my husband starts saying, why are you still on your call? But but I
Thanks,
wanted
Donna.
to address, yeah.
So go ahead, please.
I wanted to address one really important thing about the Christian response. The documents that I sent you, I tried to represent almost every Christian denomination that has a written on record response to the atrocities of the Holocaust. And as you saw, they started in 1945, and it was in Germany, and it was the evangelical German church that first issued an absolutely heartfelt apology that, like, no bones about it. We did nothing. It's against everything we believe. We are totally sinful. Oh my gosh, apology, apology, apology. Then the next one was also from an Episcopal church in Germany. So German churches and those denominations are independently run. So it's not like the Catholic Church is this big institutional church. The Lutheran Church is this worldwide church. The churches that responded first were individual localized churches. And so they had the power to speak for themselves. Then as the other churches unfolded their statements, only one other church had a legit, I confess, I confess, I confess, we confess to all these things that we did wrong, and we are sorry. And that was the Baptist church. And that was the most recent apology that came out in writing. All the other churches in between, the focus of those documents was, we've been culpable in anti-Semitism. There's anti-Semitism in our scriptures. There's anti-Semitism in the way we behave to one another. None of them outright said, they kind of skirted around the issue, said, and we are sorry. The Catholic Church did that, but only when Pope John Paul II went to Jerusalem and he inserted the little apology into the Western Wall and left it there. And we know what the context of it was, because the text of it, because he published that as well. So even the Nostra Aetate, which was the Catholic Church's document that said, oh yeah, the Jews didn't really kill Jesus and we should probably stop saying that. There was no formal apology. And I found that as a Christian really stunning, that only 2 places in all of the things that dealt with the Holocaust, you know, publicly, super publicly said, and we are sorry. So that was very impactful to me. And if you want a really good book about the church and the Holocaust, I'm going to put in the chat box the most balanced book I have found about the Catholic Church under Pope Pius XII and the response to the events that were happening in the world. And it's called Pius XII and the Holocaust, Understanding the Controversy. So I'm going to put that in the chat box so that if you want to read it, you know, it's a great book. And it's fair.
Donna, can I ask you, why was it that most of the churches felt the necessity to state that Jesus was a Jew, therefore we are sorry about this?
Because for a really, really, really long time, the church taught that Jesus really wasn't Jewish, that he was the Son of God, and therefore he was kind of a-religious. He was representing God rather than a Jew, which he was born to a Jewish woman and raised as a Jew, and that he came to found the Catholic Church. So for so long, that was the hook upon which the anti-Semitism was hung. Well, Jesus wasn't a Jew. And so I think that a lot of the churches needed to specifically say, oh, and Jesus was a Jew, so therefore, everything we had been teaching was bad about that. Yeah, it was a sneaky way around what they should have been saying, which was, boy, we sucked. We are so sorry, and we are never going to do that again.
Yeah, because to me, the issue of humanity, that this is an issue of human beings doing something to human beings, is a lot more important than direct lineage or not direct lineage to Jews or to Jesus, or,
Yep,
and
but it was really important in the understanding of a lot of the practitioners of Christianity that their hierarchy, their authority figures would say Jesus was Jewish, and therefore that gives a lot of humanity and importance to the Jewish people who exist today. It's all twisted and weird, but in the context of Christian culture, it made a huge difference.
Thank you.
Donna, would you repeat the name of the book, Douglas's book that you mentioned earlier?
Sure, it's called Orderly and Humane.
What?
Orderly
I'll put
and
it in the chat box.
Okay, thank you.
Orderly and Humane. There you go.
Thank you.
I want to thank Donna. I know that
Okay.
I'm going to continue on with everyone for the next 10 minutes or so. I'm going to thank Donna because I know that she's got to get going, and I'm going to make sure that she gets on the road.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
We'll answer some questions, and I also want to make sure to get to some of the religious component of it as well. And I want to thank Natalie for highlighting me. Shelly, your question, and Susan, I don't know if it was your question from before, but Shelly, please.
Well,
yep.
I didn't really have a question. When she was talking about what our groups were discussing, I was just going to bring up that our group was discussing truth. Yep. And if we and that truth today is so, we don't really know truth ever. And if we continue not telling the truth and knowing the truth, then this kind of stuff continues on. And curious, how can we get to the truth of things? That would be the question. How can we as a society start telling the truth? It's a big question.
It's a huge question, and there's a variety of people who have actually written about that as well. And part of it, some of it is actually about, what is it that we are willing to actually call out, as what are we willing to call out in terms of what are in fact lies or untruth, right? So part of it is, truth as a concept itself is not as obvious as some people might expect. And I know it sounds really strange, but and that's partially because our society and our culture has had a devotion to not telling the truth, towards half-hearted attachments to the truth. And so and some people, some even philosophers don't even acknowledge that true and false are in fact meaningful categories. People who claim to love truth and cause the rest of us to sort of wonder whether or not they too are sort of just simply full of it. And right, and so the reality is that there's a real question as to take a look at that there's something sort of larger, sort of too plain to notice, for which some often goes, sort of unacknowledged, is that, the truth isn't always easy to define, and we as a society and as people, we're often deeply embedded in skirting around the truth, and that really creates huge, significant issues. Let's make sure to get to some of the religious components. Yeah, that's okay. Yeah.
One of the things we didn't discuss was thinking about God after the Holocaust.
Yeah,
I'm sure it's been a major question. How can you believe in God after the Holocaust. And was it because the Jews were sinning as in olden days and they had to be punished? Ridiculousness, but it
Right.
is,
So
it
some of the
does
texts that
challenge your beliefs.
yeah, sure. So some of the texts that I sent were absolutely connected to the issue of theodicy, right? You know, and the question of theodicy is sort of where is God amidst the suffering in which we find ourselves, right? Where is God as the world burns?
Mhm.
And that question of theodicy is not a new question, but it's a question that is confronted within at least in the Jewish realm, and particularly for other religious traditions, differently at different times. And in addition to the fact of theodicy, of sort of where is God as the world burns, there's also a question for Jews, which is if we are a covenanted people, if we're the chosen people, as our texts have sort of understood. Well, where was God in that covenant, right? Where if we believe in God, where's what if a covenant is a contract, where was God in upholding God's side of the contract, right?
Right.
During the Holocaust. And you're right. I mean, in some of the readings that we talk about, in some of the ways that Jewish tradition has looked at it, right, there has been the notion that, well, there must have been some type of sin, right? There must have been some type of thing that that the people did wrong. And that answer is, especially at the scale of the Holocaust, the scale of the Shoah, becomes absolutely untenable for a great number of Jews and of people, of philosophers and theologians. It cannot be, right, that it literally cannot be that the suffering of this and the magnitude of this level of destruction and of murder, right, is because of some type of divine retribution for committing some type of sin, right? That is absolutely not acceptable. And at the same, so it really does shake for many Jews. It shakes people to their root, and at the same time, it also encourages many Jews to recommit to a recognition of a couple of things. One answer could be that in a world that looks like it does, right, there is no God, right? That is a legitimate answer for which many people, including Jews, right, come to, and that post Holocaust, the belief in God is exceedingly difficult for many people. Another answer is that is for some Jews and in other Christian faith, particularly Christian faith traditions, is that it's the meaning of this is unknown to us, and the God's divine plan is unknown to us, and that this is just a test, right? And that also is problematic for some people, because the question is, well, what kind of test is this, right? That seems unfair. But there are people who say, like, this is a test and of Jewish resilience, and this is a test of what we have to commit to, and this is a test. And then a third way it sort of becomes really prominent within Judaism is that there is a God. We're not necessarily willing to exclude God and or dismiss God. And the question is, what is our role? What is our responsibility in creating a better world? And in terms of the covenant, a recognition that covenant feels in many ways broken, but at the same time, and this goes back to the question that Michael Norman was raising earlier, a sort of sense of commitment to the traditions and commitment to the continuity of our people, particularly because of that sense that committing to the religious tradition, committing to Shabbat, and committing to holiday observance, and committing to various different things, that if we make those commitments, then we are creating a continuity that we can't let Hitler win by, if you will, by actually failing to be Jewish, by failing to commit to create continuity within the Jewish tradition. We can't let the final solution, if you will, come about by virtue of our apathy. And that becomes also a response to this question. Additional responses are, our goal is to rebuild the Jewish people, and whether or not that is rebuilding of the Jewish people in Israel, or rebuilding the Jewish people by having children, or rebuilding the Jewish people through the recommitting of Jewish principles and ideas, right? That also becomes a huge notion within within the post-Holocaust sort of Jewish recognition of this. And to be honest, I would even go as far to say that our understanding of the Holocaust was really different in 1945 through 1955 as it was, in the late 50s and early, through the 70s, and that our understanding of, of what it means to survive and what it means to commit to Judaism and what it means to, be a people and what it means to live in a Jewish tradition, that continues to evolve as we sort of go through the various different stages of growth and grief and pain after the Holocaust. David, there's a couple of questions. Leslie and David first, and then and it looks like Sharon had a question too. Sorry, please.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep. Random notes here. I agree with essentially everything Rabbi Knight just said, but let me take some of these points from a slightly different point of view. I subscribe to the point of view that we should not be asking where was God during World War II. We should be asking where is man? Our appropriate role is to do what we can in rebuilding the world every time we can. An extreme point of view would be that God allowed that experience to happen so we could discover what humanity really was capable of. I don't buy into that. I don't think many of us do. But there have been theists and deists in American history and in Jewish history. Spinoza was essentially a theist, and he was essentially excommunicated by Jewish officials for not going beyond the belief that there's a creator who's basically become an absentee landlord. Wish I could read this last comment. I'm afraid I'll read my writing after I sign off. Okay, you've waited and I can't read my handwriting.
All right, we'll go Sharon and then Leslie. Sharon. Hold on, Sharon, you're still muted.
Is
there you
this
go.
better? Okay, Rabbi, I was quite taken the other week with your discussion about Rabbi Sacks. So last night, after I read all this material, I had to look up Rabbi Sacks's, what his opinion was about where God was during the Holocaust.
Great.
And the answer was, God was there in the words, "Thou shalt not kill. You will take care of the stranger." So in other words, he is feeling that God had provided human beings with a roadmap, but some people weren't following that.
Right. We choose whether or not to follow the roadmap.
Right. And then other people I know, I had a discussion with my uncle, who was an Orthodox rabbi. This goes back decades. And his position was, as was, I think, some Orthodox people, was that people like me who were not terribly observant, this was God's way of letting us know we need to be more observant, which, I couldn't accept it all. But then there is the issue that mankind has free will. So can we really blame God if mankind has free will? I mean, that brings up that whole other issue. So
yeah, that's a big.
Yeah.
Leslie, and then we have to stop for today. Leslie. Leslie, you're on mute. I'm sorry.
I apologize. I really like what Sharon had to say, particularly about free will. I asked Susan Cherniak Spatz once, after her experience in the Holocaust, did she believe in God afterwards? And she told me not for a long time. And and then she explained to me how the experience itself was so overwhelming and her anger was so intense. And her response to it all, and the fact that there seemed to be such a malaise in the world around her, but that human beings helped her restore her faith in our congregation, particularly helped her to restore her faith in God. But she saw God not as somebody who or as an entity that would act directly, but as an inspiration to mankind.
Yeah. Beautiful. Well, thank you, everyone. Our next time that we're going to be meeting, we're going to be actually having an opportunity to learn from Rabbi Stuart Gershon, who's going to be talking with us about the sort of last component of our learning, and we're going to be focused in that sort of last lecture on sort of conversations about not just like the global reactions, the political and social and sort of global reactions to the Holocaust. So we're going to continue in that vein. It's actually, sorry, excuse me. The last section is about how hurt people, sort of the resurgence of modern anti-Semitism. Sorry, is going to be what Rabbi Gershon is going to be talking about. Again, the resurgence of modern anti-Semitism. So we'll talk about that and move forward. So thank you, everyone. I really appreciate your attendance today.
Thank you.
And
Thank
when
you.